right. So we're getting into part 2 this morning of our examination of the sin incontinency, lack of temperance, said another way. You will probably have noticed in the first part, so in the first part what we did is we established that the idea of self-control is not something that is foreign to the world. Before any of us in this room could call themselves a Christian, we're already seeing that in this world we are expected to conduct ourselves in a certain way so that we can be acceptable to other people, that we can exist in relative peace with others in a society. We talked about how there seems to be a tendency, specifically with religion, where for people that are not Christians, for instance, they view the rules of Christianity as something that they're not convinced they want to be subject to. They see it as extremely restrictive. But the idea of having to control oneself according to certain preset standards is something that these same individuals will already be used to. So the question became then, well, what is the problem with the idea of religion? Why is it that people are going to be so ready to just plug themselves into society and try to conform to all the norms of society, but they're unwilling to really consider that when it comes to religion? They're saying, well, religion is too hard, religion's too restrictive. And we said a part of that is going to come from the idea that they may not have faith that what religion is providing is actually so good that it deserves their obedience or their conformity to it. So we're going to look at some notes really quickly. You'll also probably notice that, and especially in this second part, one thing that I'm not spending a lot of time on is the idea of incontinence or intemperance in the sense of like the momentary emotional outburst. And the reason I'm not doing that is because I think that there's a couple of reasons that I'm not really spending a lot of time talking about momentary losses of self-control, heightened states of emotion, things of that nature. It's because one, I think everybody kind of agrees that being out of control of yourself in the moment is a bad thing. But the question is, well, how do we avoid getting there? Like, how is it that we set up a hedge around us so that we aren't constantly flying off the handle? And so that's going to be some of what we're going to be looking at. So now, notes from last time. We said everyone in the world understands the concept of self-control. If they don't, they wind up in jail, hospital, or homeless. No self-control equals sins against worldly standards. So I'm phrasing it that way for a reason, right? When we set a goal in this life and we fail to conduct ourselves in a way that will attain that goal, we're basically sinning against our own ideal. We've set this standard for ourselves, we've set this goal, and when we refuse to control our behavior such that we actually meet that goal, we're basically sinning against our own motives. We said the Bible recognizes incontinence and temperance as a sin, right? Against what the Bible would say that our motives or our goals should be. No self-control equals sins against godly standards. We said the very concept of self-control indicates that we may be moved or motivated to do and say things that are not preferable, right? So the idea that we even have this on our mind to begin with, whether in the secular world or in religion, the fact that self-control is a concept, it presupposes the idea that sometimes we're going to be moved by our emotional responses to the situation that we find ourselves in to do things that might not be preferable, that won't actually be conducive to a good final product or a good end. This was our definition that we're using for the purposes of this class, right? In the context of a defined goal, incontinence is it's counterproductive actions driven by emotion, allowing emotions to rule over reason. Now we're going to be looking at it, we're going to be doing a compare and contrast of two figures that are pretty familiar to us, and that's going to be Joseph and Haman. So we're going to be looking at these two biblical characters, and we're going to be looking at how they are conducting themselves, and then we're going to draw some conclusions about it. So keeping in remembrance this point right here, we said that the very concept of self-control indicates that we may be moved or motivated to do and say things that are not preferable. So let's look at Joseph first. Joseph, as we're examining Joseph, we're going to be looking for these themes: reasoning and being spiritually minded, those two things together. So he's using his reason. And what I'm saying is he's implementing self-control. And he's being spiritually minded, which means right in the context of a specific goal was part of our definition. So his specific goal is he wants to, at the end of the day, he wants to be a godly person. He wants to live in a godly way. He wants the effects of his life to be godly overall, and he's going to be applying his reasoning to that end. In Genesis chapter 39, starting at verse 7, it says, "It came to pass after these things that his master's wife cast her eyes upon Joseph." So Joseph has worked himself into a favored position as a servant where he's got all the responsibility of his master's house in his control. Yes, James?
And his wife wanted Joseph to lie with her.
That's right. And that's the scene we're looking at right now. So Joseph's an individual who has had favor given to him. He's been given a lot of responsibility. There's a lot of trust that's vested in him. And he's actually going to cite that. He's in this moment where a woman is trying to tempt him to do the wrong thing. In verse 8, his response is, "He refused and said unto his master's wife, Behold, my master wotteth not what is with me in the house, and he hath committed all that he hath into my hands." He's saying, my master trusts me so much, he's not even keeping track of his own possessions. It's all on me. And he trusts me so much that he's not even, all the books are in my control. He's not doing any inventory on his own. In verse 9, it says, "There is none greater in this house than I. Neither hath he kept back anything from me but thee, because thou art his wife. How then can I do this great wickedness and sin against God?" And I'm at the bottom here in red, I'm pointing out the fact that Joseph is reasoning with her. Like in that moment where she's trying to tempt him to do the wrong thing with her, he doesn't just respond in an emotionally negative way, but he actually offers all of these different reasons why it'd be a bad thing. I have all this trust vested in me, it'd be a betrayal of my master. I have all these blessings afforded to me as a servant. Why would I trade that to do the wrong thing with you? And then on top of that, it's against my God. I'd be sinning against my God to do this thing. So we have his reason, and he's applying his reason toward his defined goal, which is to be a godly individual. He wants to be a trustworthy individual. He's not willing to trade all of the blessings of his position for an indiscretion. So now let's contrast Haman. And Haman is another, you could call him a chief servant. He was a chief minister to the king. And as we're looking at his story, we're going to be looking for these themes with Haman. Emotionality, right? His emotions are going to be playing a part in the scenario, and he's going to be worldly minded. His goals aren't godly goals. His goals are serving himself. He's concerned with worldly things, and we're going to see that highlighted in the portions that we're going to be looking at here. In Esther chapter 5, verse 9, it says, "Then went Haman forth that day joyful and with a glad heart." So he just received what he considered to be a pretty high honor bestowed upon him from the Queen Esther and the king. And as he's leaving, it says he goes forth that day joyful with a glad heart. But when Haman saw Mordecai in the king's gate, that he stood not up nor moved for him, he was full of indignation against Mordecai. So he's on his way to wherever he's going. He's passing this particular Jew who decides that he's not going to bestow further honor upon him by getting up or bowing or moving out of the way or whatever. He doesn't move for Haman, and Haman's filled with indignation against this individual. In verse 10, it says, "Nevertheless, Haman refrained himself, and when he came home, he sent and called for his friends and Zeresh his wife. And Haman told them of the glory of his riches, the multitude of his children, all the things wherein the king had promoted him, how he had advanced him above the princes and the servants of the king. Haman said, moreover, Yea, Esther the queen did let no man come in with the king unto the banquet that she had prepared but myself. And tomorrow I am invited unto her also with the king. Yet all this availeth me nothing, so long as I see Mordecai the Jew sitting at the king's gate." Now, did we see where Haman actually used a little bit of self-control? Back here? He refrained himself. So what did he really want to do when Mordecai didn't move out of the way? He's controlling himself. He's deciding not to give vent to his emotions right there on the street. He decides to restrain his, whatever it might have been, an outburst or the expression of his intense disappointment or anger that this Jew just didn't jump up at his approach. So he controls it. But later on, he's burning. he recounts all of the ways that he's blessed, and he says he can't even enjoy any of that so long as he doesn't have the respect of this one particular Jew. Now, how does that differ from Joseph? If we can contrast that with Joseph, because we have two individuals who are chief ministers, chief servants, right? Joseph is, and certainly Joseph, we're going to see his station increase as we go along, but we have Joseph who's being given authority over the entire house of his master. We have Mordecai who's advanced above all the other princes, right? He's the chief minister to the king. We have Joseph who's been given all these blessings, and he's not going to allow himself to be tempted in a way that basically puts all that in danger, forfeits all those blessings and causes him to betray his God. On the other hand, we have Haman, who has all these blessings, and it's not that he doesn't want to put them at risk. He can't even enjoy the fact that he has those blessings until he gets this Jew under his thumb. He's hyper-focused on this Jew. Now, there's going to be character is going to come into play here. So when we're talking about self-control, is it enough just to have self-control? Haman showed a little bit of self-control. He wanted to blow up on this Jew, and he didn't do it. Are we saying that in and of itself makes whatever Haman's actions are going to be, does that make Haman's actions good just because they're measured? Yes.
So a moment ago, I think you asked what was the difference between the two.
Yeah.
So Joseph is practicing self-control in order to actually do good by somebody else, while Haman's self-control is simply self-serving. Right.
So purpose, right? So the goal matters. So when we're talking about our definition, we're saying, well, it's making sure that you don't have emotion overrunning your reason, but we said it's in the context of a defined goal. We have Haman over here, and he's controlling himself in order for some kind of a worldly end. Now, with Joseph, I'm saying this: Joseph was guided by his reason in his self-control, which informed his emotions. Now, Joseph winds up going to prison, if we all know the story of Joseph. This interaction between Potiphar's wife and himself winds up with Joseph going to jail. So we're going to be looking at Joseph, and we're going to be tracking his character as we go along. And we're not going to see a word. We're not going to see the word self-control, or we're not going to see temperance. I don't believe we're going to see the word he refrained himself in there. But we're going to notice what happens with Joseph. His situation drastically changes, and his behavior remains very consistent. So that is going to be a part of, as we get on further in the lesson, we're going to be saying, how can we be like a Joseph type, where we're keeping our behavior consistent? Remember the example where the idea was to get to work and be presentable, be on time and presentable. And we said, well, when we encounter something that challenges our ability to do that, some variable pops up, the elevator doesn't work. Do we then go ahead and blame the world and this elevator and the person who's supposed to maintain the elevator? Or do we say we're just going to make an adjustment to our lives so that we are able to consistently hit our target? Joseph is an individual that is successful at consistently hitting his target. So we're going to look at that to settle that in our mind. This is Joseph before prison. In Genesis chapter 39, starting at verse 3, says, "His master saw that the Lord was with him, and that the Lord made all that he did to prosper in his hand. And Joseph found grace in his sight, and he served him, and he made him overseer over his house and all that he had put into his hand." So he sees that the Lord makes everything prosper in Joseph's hand. So he says, well, I want to give this guy all of the responsibility of my house because I know that he's going to do well with it, that it's going to prosper in his hand. It came to pass from the time that he made him overseer in his house. No, it came to pass from, the time that he had made him overseer in his house and over all that he had, that the Lord blessed the Egyptian's house for Joseph's sake. And the blessing of the Lord was upon all that he had in the house and in the field. And he left all that he had in Joseph's hand, and he knew not aught he had save the bread which he did eat. And Joseph was a goodly person and well favored. So he's able to take a totally hands-off approach because he just trusts Joseph this much. And it starts with this idea up here that the Lord, that his master saw that the Lord was with him, and that the Lord made all that he did to prosper in his hand. Now this is Joseph in prison. Genesis chapter 39 and starting at verse 20. Joseph's master took him and put him into the prison, a place where the king's prisoners were bound, and he was there in the prison. But the Lord was with Joseph and showed him mercy and gave him favor in the sight of the keeper of the prison. And the keeper of the prison committed to Joseph's hand all the prisoners that were in the prison, and whatsoever they did there, he was the doer of it. The keeper of the prison looked not to anything that was under his hand, because the Lord was with him, and that which he did, the Lord made it to prosper. So Joseph's free and he's in his master's house, and what does his master do with Joseph? What is his master's attitude toward Joseph? It's like total trust, isn't it? I trust this guy to do right by me with my property, my possessions. Joseph goes to prison. So when an individual falls from a high place to a low place, what are some of the emotions that might attend that change in status, if we just put ourselves in that position?
If you can go from top to bottom so quickly, I think a lot of people would say
Can be trusted.
that, or if you're the person, you would say, why bother?
Mm-hmm.
It was taken that quickly away from me.
Yeah.
What's the point?
Yeah, what was the use of being such a diligent, careful person? If all of it can just be taken away, nobody appreciates what I do. I mean, a lot of people could become bitter, resentful. That would start to manifest in their actions. A trustworthy person could then become a very untrustworthy, unreliable person, depending on how they view their circumstances. Is that not the case? Yeah. So, but we see Joseph in prison, and what happens with Joseph? What's the attitude of the keeper of the prison toward Joseph?
Views him as a good man.
Views him as a good man. It's total trust again. Now, so I've been to jail, and it takes a little bit of work to become what they call a trustee in jail, but you're not just given, like they're still looking at what you do. Like you're not just given total control and freedom within the walls of the jail. Joseph is in here running stuff for the other prisoners. He's got so much trust that the keeper of the prison isn't even bothered with paying attention to whatever Joseph's doing. So we see that the result is, in both cases, the Lord is with Joseph, and the result is that those people that are over Joseph are just totally trustful of what he's doing. As a result, even though he's in jail, does he have more freedom than your average prisoner would? So whether his circumstances are high or low, what is Joseph? That's a free man. Now, if Joseph chose to have an intense, like let his intense negative emotions rule the day, because I'm sure he wasn't happy that he was lied upon. After demonstrating his character, all it took was the lie of this one sketchy woman to get all that ripped from him and have him thrown into jail. If he wanted to just go ahead and take a negative view of that, then what would it be? Would he have as much freedom in jail if he hadn't demonstrated this character? So, somebody say something?
Probably not.
Probably not. So a condition of Joseph's freedom is what?
Because he's trustworthy.
He's trustworthy. He's maintaining. So James brings up a point about there's an aspect in which there's a portion of which, well, we'll get into that in a second. So a big determining factor when it comes to Joseph's actual freedom, whether he's in a high position or a low position, is the consistent demonstration of his character, which is going to require self-control. He's not just giving himself over to his emotions to be unstable. He's being very consistent. And why is he able to be very consistent? What makes us as Christians very, if we're able to be consistent in our religion, even if things don't look like they're panning out, what does that take?
I would say he had a certain type of outlook.
Outlooks, could we call it faith? Joseph has faith in the principles that he believes in to carry him through, and he's not going to let his circumstances dictate to him whether or not he's going to hold to those things. So we were saying earlier, one of the reasons why outsiders looking in to the Christian religion might say, well, that looks really restrictive, is because they don't believe that the end result of the regulations that God imposes is going to actually be more freedom than what we might otherwise experience if we just let our emotions rule the day. So Joseph, his freedom depends on his character. His character is going to be demonstrated through his ability to control, let his reason win out over whatever negative emotions that he feels. Now here's Joseph after prison. Pharaoh said unto Joseph, forasmuch as God hath showed thee all this, there is none so discreet and wise as thou art. Now this is what James was talking about earlier. Joseph gets out of prison because he's able to interpret dreams for the Pharaoh, and as a result, he's able to save he's able to save the nation from 7 years of famine that are coming upon them, because there's going to be first 7 years of plenty, then famine. Joseph interprets the dream, which causes Pharaoh to put him in charge of managing the resources until that time comes, so everybody's able to get through this tough period. So this is how Joseph winds up being put in charge of not just Potiphar's house, but now he's in charge of all of Egypt. And it says in starting in verse 39 of chapter 41 of Genesis, Pharaoh said unto Joseph, forasmuch as God hath showed thee all this, and there is none so discreet and wise as thou art, thou shalt be over my house, and according unto thy word shall all my people be ruled. Only in the throne will I be greater than thou. And Pharaoh said unto Joseph, see, I have set over thee all the land of Egypt. And Pharaoh took off his ring from his hand, and put it upon Joseph's hand, and arrayed him in vestures of fine linen, and put a gold chain about his neck. And he made him to ride in the second chariot which he had, and they cried before him, bow the knee. And he made him ruler over all the land of Egypt. And Pharaoh said unto Joseph, I am Pharaoh, and without thee shall no man lift up his hand or foot in all the land of Egypt. So with Joseph going, so there was some divine activity that took place here, wasn't there? Joseph was given the power to interpret dreams. So he's getting some direct revelation from God that he's then able to use to jump from being in prison, albeit, the highest position a prisoner can hold in the prison, to being second command to the Pharaoh himself. And it's the result of him demonstrating to Pharaoh that clearly the Lord is with this man, because he's able to accurately interpret these dreams. But there's another factor that's at work here. Okay, so now we've seen all this going on with Joseph. Okay, his consistent behavior, his self-control, his faith in godly principles that were able to afford him the greatest amount of freedom, regardless of his circumstances. Now with Haman, this is all I'm going to show about Haman. So they hanged Haman on the gallows that he had prepared for Mordecai. Then was the king's wrath pacified. So this was the result of Haman. Haman's applying himself, like he had his certain amount of self-control. He developed a whole plot to have Mordecai killed, and he winds up getting hanged on the gallows prepared for Mordecai. So there couldn't be a greater contrast here, right? Society controlled for a man like Haman. He ultimately was put to death. But now with Joseph, when we see his rising and falling in terms of his social status, but everybody that he was under regarded him very well, I'm saying there was some divine activity that was taking place, but it's not just total magic going on here. In Genesis chapter 39, verse 3, it said, his master saw that the Lord was with him, and that the Lord made all he did to prosper in his hand. Now we know that Joseph was committed to his God and to the principles that his God would have him committed to. It was one of the reasons that he gave to Potiphar's wife. He said, on top of all these other things, I'd be sinning against God. In Jeremiah chapter 7, verse 22, it says, for I spake not unto your fathers. This is God's message to the children of Israel. I spake not unto your fathers, nor commanded them in the day that I brought them out of the land of Egypt concerning burnt offerings or sacrifices. But this thing I commanded them, saying, obey my voice, and I will be your God, and ye shall be my people. And walk ye in all the ways that I have commanded you, that it may be well with you. So this is Joseph. Joseph is committed to obeying the voice of the Lord, to those things that will cause his circumstances to be well with him. And we saw that no matter what circumstances he was in, his faith in those things and his self-control in applying his will to following what God would have him follow, it resulted in positive things for Joseph, no matter his circumstances. So for us, this is going to be the key. We're not going to be expecting to interpret dreams, but the idea is, do we have faith in the principles that God has laid down? Are we going to be committing ourselves to those principles? Now, we're going to ask this question: how do I grow my self-control, though? How do I set up a scene where, until my character is developed enough so that I can start being more autonomous, how can I build up the strength of my character so that I'm consistently controlling myself in a sense where I'm doing the right thing all the time, or I'm thinking to do the right thing, I'm seeking to do the right thing all the time, instead of lapsing into disorder, my life lapsing into disorder with regard to my Christian faith. Now, I had several videos the sound isn't playing, so I'm just going to have to show an image, and I'm going to have to tell you what's in the video. So this is an ex-Navy SEAL, and he's having a discussion with an individual on a podcast, and he became a Navy SEALs instructor. And he said that he had the opportunity as an instructor. He said, when I was going through training, I didn't have all this time to be worried about what was happening to all these other guys, that you'd wake up one morning and they just wouldn't be there, and you would just keep on going because you expect for people to be dropping out. He said, but as an instructor, I got to have a little bit of time with these guys that were washing out of the program. And he said, one of the things that I would ask him is, when you came here, you said that this was your life's goal. You said that there was nothing else you wanted to do. You said this was like the highest attainment that you wanted to achieve, and here you are, you're quitting. And he said, so I had the opportunity to ask why. And he said that one of the biggest response, really what it all boiled down to, was they got overwhelmed. They're being subjected to intense pressures, but he said in the podcast as well, the point of the SEALs training is really to test your brain. Are you going to be able to control your mind enough to get through whatever it is they're putting you through? That's the test. He said that individuals that washed out, what it all wound up boiling down to was they got overwhelmed. They would be in the moment under extreme pressure, and they would think, I have so many more months of this. I can't do it. And they would just give up. He said the guys that were able to get through, the consistent theme was they kept their world small. And what he said he meant by that was they worried about what was happening in that day, in that hour. I'm going to get through this, and then I'm going to have this lunch period, and that'll be a great break. And then there's going to be another hour or 4 hours of training, and then the day's over. And they would just keep it small. They would keep it focused. And that's not going to play. Okay. Now, in Matthew chapter 6, verse 24, we have this principle spoken of. The idea is, right, as Christians, we're all here, we agree that the Bible's the truth. We agree that what's in the Bible is the best possible thing that we could be committing ourselves to for the benefit of ourselves, for the preservation of our own personal freedoms, as we saw in Joseph's case, for the health of society. It is the best thing that we can commit ourselves to. But some people would say, well, man, starting off as a Christian is pretty overwhelming. It can be very overwhelming. Keep the world small. Matthew chapter 6, verse 24. No man can serve two masters, for either he will hate the one and love the other, or else he will hold to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and mammon. Therefore I say unto you, take no thought of your life, what you shall eat, what you shall drink, nor yet for your body, what you shall put on. Is not the life more than meat, and the body than raiment? Behold the fowls of the air, for they sow not, neither do they reap, nor gather into barns, yet your heavenly Father feedeth them. Are ye not much better than they? Which of you by taking aught can add 1 cubit unto his stature? And why take ye thought for raiment? Consider the lilies of the field, how they grow. They toil not, neither do they spin. And yet I say unto you that even Solomon in all his glory was not arrayed like one of these. So he continues on about, on this topic, and at the end it says, seek ye first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, and all these things shall be added unto you. Keep your world small. Just focus on your steps, what you need to do in order to fulfill your duty as a Christian. This is going to prepare us for approaching the rest of our life in an appropriate way. That doesn't cause us to be so overwhelmed by all the things we have to pay attention to that we don't actually do any one thing well, including our own personal Christian growth. So I'm saying in terms of setting up a scenario where we're able to really control ourselves and apply ourselves as Christians, this is going to be one of them, keeping our world small. What are our real priorities? And let's only focus on those things. Now, here's another one, and I'm saying having faith in the payoff. This is something that Joseph had. He was able to demonstrate a consistent character regardless of his circumstances, regardless of the pressures being put on him. He was able to be very consistent. We know that took self-control. He was putting his faith in the payoff rather than in his immediate circumstances. This is a young woman who immigrated from Russia when she was younger. Her parents lived through the decline and the fall of the Soviet empire, communist empire. And she had a pretty tough life. And she's in another podcast. She's having a discussion with a psychologist. And he's asking her questions about what she finds pleasure in. And one of the things that she says she finds pleasure in is playing the piano. And he said, well, when did you learn to play the piano? And she said, well, I only learned to play it. She said, I only really could start playing it about 3 years ago, but she's been plugging away at it for quite a while. So the psychologist says, well, that's a happy ending. And he said, because you had to put in a certain amount of work to do that. He said, just like with children, when they learn to read, before they can really enjoy reading a book, even a children's book, they have to put in a great many laborious hours just figuring out how these letters go together. And they're not exactly having fun. They're not really enjoying the final product. But at the end of that road, they get to read a book and really enjoy the content of the book. And he said similar with playing a piano. It's not something you really get a ton of fulfillment out of or enjoyment in as you're picking up the skill. But once you pick the skill up, you're really able to enjoy the fruits of that skill, and it really enriches your life. So it's about having faith in the payoff, why you would put in work on the front end that doesn't necessarily elevate your emotions, right? So when people become Christians, or as people are going through hard times in their Christian faith, I think that it's common for them to focus on how they're feeling in their Christian faith, and they're not really having enough faith in the payoff. Galatians chapter 6, verse 7, it says, "Be not deceived, God is not mocked, for whatsoever a man soweth, that shall he also reap. For he that soweth unto his flesh shall of the flesh reap corruption, but he that soweth unto the Spirit shall of the Spirit reap everlasting life. Let us not be weary in well-doing." So what's the implication here? Well-doing doesn't always feel fantastic, right? Sometimes it's real work. "Let us not be weary in well-doing, for in due season we shall reap if we faint not." So that's just like with any other activity that we put a ton of effort into. We maintain self-control in part so that we can structure our lives to achieve our goal, in part because we have faith in the payoff at the end. Now, this is another aspect. Don't wait until motivated by a problem. So in this podcast clip, the political commentator is pointing out a phenomenon in politics, specifically with voting. So there's data that shows conclusively that when there's a Democrat in office, of all of the people that are registered to vote, there's a higher turnout of Republicans or conservatives whenever there's a Democrat in the White House. And conversely, whenever there's a Republican in the White House, of all the people that are registered to vote, a higher percentage of liberals turn out to vote. And what's the reason? It's because the guy you don't like is actually in office. But the theme here is don't wait until motivated by a problem. What if a liberal had a liberal person in the White House and they were going to turn out 100% in force every time, regardless of whether they were happy of the state of affairs or not? What if they just showed up anyway to make sure that a Republican never got into office? They could do that, couldn't they? Instead of just being waited to be motivated by a problem. So, Matthew chapter 7, verse 24, "Don't wait to be motivated by a problem. Therefore, whosoever heareth these sayings of mine and doeth them, I will liken him unto a wise man which built his house upon a rock. And the rain descended, and the floods came, the winds blew, and beat upon that house, and it fell not, for it was founded upon a rock. And everyone that heareth these sayings of mine and doeth them not shall be likened unto a foolish man which built his house upon the sand. And the rain descended, and the floods came, and the winds blew, and beat upon that house, and it fell, and great was the fall of it. And it came to pass, when Jesus had ended these sayings, the people were astonished at his doctrine." Now, when Joseph went from being the man that was over Potiphar's house to being cast into prison, accused of rape or attempted rape, was that his house falling according to Matthew chapter 7, verse 24? Was that verse 27, "The rain descended, the floods came, and the winds blew and beat upon the house, and it fell, and great was the fall of it"?
Was it Joseph's house falling?
Yeah, like if we're going to apply this to Joseph's life.
He was in a storm, but it didn't fall apart.
That's right. So Joseph didn't fall apart, because what happened when he hit jail? He maintained his spiritual bearing, and he wound up being put in charge of the jail, the activities of the jail. So Joseph was actually the individual that founded his house upon the rock. He had faith in the outcome of solid spiritual principles. He maintained his bearing regardless of the circumstances, and he was able to withstand the storm.
A big part of that is he knew that he was innocent.
Right. Yeah. So he gets to have the conviction of character of knowing that he did the right thing regardless of what other people thought of it. So he didn't compromise himself in that sense. So when we're talking about our conversation about maintaining self-control, one of the things that we do is we don't wait for problems to come up before we start to prepare our soul. So that's the point of our consistent Bible study, what we're doing today, what we do on Wednesdays, and hopefully what we're doing in our free time. We're preparing ourselves for the problems we know will likely come, just like the individual that founded his house upon the rock. He didn't found his house upon the rock because, boy, we're in a storm and we better try to get this thing together, on a slab of rock. He founded on the rock with the expectations that future storms may be approaching. And that's one thing that we can do to make it easier for us to maintain our bearing, to maintain our self-control when the pressure's on, is we actually take advanced measures in terms of our spiritual preparation, our study, and indeed our social circle. This is one of the things, like I mentioned this in the last study, and I'm going to elaborate a little bit on it now. Social circle is going to wind up being indispensable in terms of helping us maintain our self-control in the context of our desired goal, which is to be spiritual individuals. So in 1 Peter chapter 4, verse 3, it says, "For the time past of our life may suffice us to have wrought the will of the Gentiles, when we walked in lasciviousness, lusts, excesses of wine, revelings, banquetings, and abominable idolatries, wherein they think it strange that ye run not with them to the same excess of riot, speaking evil of you." So we're getting that social feedback, right? You don't want to participate in these things, and they think it's weird, and they're calling you out for it, and they're maligning you, making you seem like you're the strange one for not wanting to do what everybody else is doing. Romans chapter 1, verse 32, "Who knowing the judgment of God," speaking of ungodly individuals, "who knowing the judgment of God, that they which commit such things are worthy of death, not only do the same, but have pleasure in them that do them." So at the same time, if you're trying to abstain from worldly things, not only are you getting negative social feedback from people that want to make you feel weird for not doing the same thing they're doing, but at the same time, you're going to be seeing other ungodly individuals celebrated while you're being maligned. They're going to be celebrated. So this is all social feedback. 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verse 33, "Be not deceived, evil communications corrupt good manners, awake to righteousness." Now, at the bottom I have, if we do not seek social support in pursuing what is good, we are going to find no shortage of social support in going astray, that was a main point from last week's lesson. So Caleb brought up this point, and I just had to include it because I thought it was a very good point. He brought it up I actually forget where you said it, but his point was distance creates occasion, and he was talking about putting distance between yourself and folks that would give you social feedback, enables you to do things that they might disagree with, enables you to indulge in things more easily that they would disagree with. And the example he used for this point was the prodigal son. It says that in verse 13, he took his journey into a far country and there wasted his substance with riotous living. If he wanted to get away with this, he had to get out of his social milieu. He wasn't going to be able to just hang out there, get away with this activity and enjoy it, because he was going to be getting all of this feedback from his society saying you shouldn't be doing these things, we're not going to support it. So he had to leave the area. So when we know that that's a principle, that putting distance between you and your social circle tends to increase occasion for going astray, that highlights the importance of our social circle. We're going to be getting negative feedback from the world if we don't engage in what they engage in. So where are we going to find our support? We want to be proximal to our support group when it comes to the Christian faith. As Christians, this is our support group under this roof here, our immediate support group. As Christians, we have agreed that the Bible contains the best ideas, guidance, and guidance for achieving those goals. 2 Peter chapter 1, verse 2, "Grace and peace be multiplied unto you through the knowledge of God and of Jesus our Lord, according as his divine power hath given unto us all things that pertain unto life and godliness." Now, let's look at these few verses here. In these few verses, Galatians chapter 6, verse 1, Hebrews chapter 10, verse 24, James chapter 5, verse 16, and James chapter 5, verse 19, if we read these verses, we're going to be seeing that we just saw a list of verses that said we would be getting social feedback from people that would have us be worldly. All these verses have to do with social feedback from people that would have us be godly. If we're maintaining proximity, if we're maintaining our our Christian social circle, we're going to be getting this kind of feedback. Brethren, if a man be overtaken by a fault, ye which are spiritual, restore such a one in the spirit of meekness, considering thyself, lest thou also be tempted. Hebrews chapter 10, verse 24. Let us consider one another to provoke unto love and unto good works, not forsaking the assembling of ourselves together. James chapter 5, verse 16. Confess your faults one to another, pray one for another, that ye may be healed. The effectual fervent prayer of a righteous man availeth much. James chapter 5, verse 19. Brethren, if any of you do err from the truth, and one convert him, let him know that he which converteth a sinner from the error of his way shall save a soul from death and shall hide a multitude of sins. And I'm asking the question at the bottom, what does all this tell us? What do all these verses tell us about our ability to perfectly maintain our orientation in the faith? Maintaining our self-control is greatly aided by what? One, it's going to happen because we're being told that we need to be trying to correct and help one another maintain the path, maintain our orientation spiritually. So it's telling us on the front end we need this. And then it's telling us to provide it to one another. So I'm saying this, being deeply connected with brothers and sisters to whom we feel responsible is indispensable to maintaining proper spiritual orientation, which is inseparable from maintaining spiritual self-control. Now, everybody good with that so far? Okay, I know I'm kind of getting fast here, but I got to be wrapping it up pretty soon. So this was the quote that I had from last week from the psychologist that was saying, we all help one another stay on the proper path. We all help one another stay oriented. He says, we outsource the problem of sanity. People remain mentally healthy not merely because of the integrity of their own minds, but because they are constantly being reminded how to think, how to act, and speak by those around them. If you begin to deviate from the straight and narrow path, if you begin to act improperly, people will react to your errors before they become too great and cajole, laugh, tap, criticize you back into place. So this is him saying this is how it works in society. We know this is how it works. It works this way with us too. We're just operating by a different standard. We're just helping to correct one another by a different standard. And it's an encouraging thing. It's not like a hard thing, right? Before the issues get too great, all of this is kind of encouraging. It's keeping it light. We're laughing, we're cajoling, we're tapping, we're helping one another. Now, this is Jordan Peterson, a psychologist, and he's having a discussion with a woman who fled Islam. She fled Afghanistan, and now she writes a lot of books. And he was discussing with her the nature of immigration and the crises that some countries are having with big influxes of Muslim immigrants. And she was saying that one of the biggest problems is not so much socioeconomic differences, like the people in this country have possessions and they're stable. These new people are coming in and they don't have jobs yet and they're poorer. She said that's not really the defining factor of the issues that are plaguing some of these nations. She said the defining factor is differences in moral standards. She said that's really the problem with assimilation. She said she identified two things that were necessary. One, and you see I have the title above this video, the role of confidence and humility in the idea of self-control in terms of how it's supported by us all together as a group. Confidence and humility play a part. So she said the confidence of the receiving society, they have to have a high degree of confidence in their own moral values as a society. They have to be able to say, look, you guys are coming here for a reason. We are doing well for a reason. It is appropriate if you adopt our moral norms, at least the way you conduct yourself in our society. She said it's very difficult for a society who doesn't have a high degree of confidence in basically, like I forget what word she used. It was something a little bit more politically correct than supremacy. But it winds up coming like there are better moral standards than others. And she said you have to be confident as a receiving nation that your moral standards are better and the evidence should be in the product of your culture. She said so the receiving society has to be confident, and they have to be confident enough to tell the people that are coming in that they need to adjust their ways of thinking. And she said the people that are coming in have to be humble enough to realize I'm fleeing an awful place. I'm coming to what you have established. Clearly, whatever you guys are doing is better than where I'm coming from. So when we're talking about it in terms of our own ability to maintain self-control, Caleb brought up a point last week saying, well, a part of that is going to be when you receive the social feedback, you have to be able to receive it without flying off the handle and getting upset and rejecting it. And that's the case. That's where the humility comes in. We have to be humble enough to be able to receive from one another so that we're able to grow together in a consistent way. Help us to maintain our self-control. This is going to help us from going astray. And the folks that are doing the helping and giving the feedback, they need to have confidence, which means what? We have to be doing our study. We have to be preparing ourselves to help one another. It's a social responsibility. So that's all that I've got. I know I kind of picked up speed toward the end there, but are there any questions or comments? Okay, I'm going to get out of the way for Caleb to set up.